Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Revolution Blueprint. I'm Rob Iobbi, and we have some interesting, great news for you today. We held this back last week. I want to introduce our new co-host. His name is Will Hana. Will Hana is an Army vet, served in Desert Storm, served in intelligence. He is a prominent figure in Baltimore politics, one of the leading activists, if you will. He is from Park Heights. He knows his thing or two about urban politics. He's also worked in intelligence with the DOJ, and we are honored to have Will here on the show with us. Our goal here with the Revolution Blueprint from this day moving forward is we really want to get into the red, white, and the black. So we want to look at all the things that are affecting our nation, our local communities, the nation as a whole. And we want to look at it through the black lens, and we want to look at it through the white lens, and we obviously want to test it to the Constitution. So all things here, red, white, and black. And without further ado, Will Hana.
Absolutely. Good morning. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. Glad to be new co-host of the Revolutionary Blueprint. And I want to jump right into the show. Jump right into the social show. What are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to talk about the book launch last week, and we have the Constitution created a durable and adaptable framework for governing the nation, embodying principles designed to safeguard liberty, ensure justice, and provide government accountable to the people. So we want to talk about that, how that applies to border security, immigration, and themes in the book. So, Rob, what do you think about that?
Man, I feel like we could spend a whole hour plus just talking about border security and everything that's going on with the efforts from the executive branch and the militarization of our communities. That's kind of part of that, and also kind of transcended into fighting crime too. But with that said, obviously I think that almost all red-blooded Americans that get up every day and go to work, want a secure border. That I think that issue is an 80, 90%, 10% issue. We could probably debate on, the methodology in our approach to securing, our border. But we have probably upwards of 40 million plus people that are undocumented living here in the country. And I'd say that there's probably a pretty significant percentage of them that are dangerous and they need to get out. So, the National Guard is necessary, but, if applied wrong and again, testing it to the Constitution, if it doesn't fit in the constitutional box, I have a problem with it.
So now this is the area that I worked in. When I was at the Department of Justice, I worked in the Office of Immigration Litigation, and I worked at the U.S. Immigration Courts. And so looking at it from the lens of where government is and where some community come from. And I'll give from our community as well. But the biggest problem they had with immigration was when they split up DOJ. When they split up the Department of Justice and created the Department of Homeland Security, they split up the immigration assets. So you had the immigration courts on one side, and then you split the INS, which now became ICE, and you move that over to the Department of Homeland Security.
And this is post-Patriot Act policy,
Post-Patriot Act policy.
I got
so
you.
It just now the systems don't talk to each other. DHS has its own firewalls, and DOJ has its own firewalls, and they don't communicate necessarily the same.
What? Inefficient government? What?
And they're both vying for different budgets.
Right. Different budgets where they were all consolidated at one time. And so now you took all of those assets and now you made them different. So the point being, it is one thing to take the Border Patrol and ICE and all of those assets, and then you want to protect the border, but how do you, and we figured out how to do it. I will say Donald Trump has figured out how to protect the border.
Yeah.
Because we went from millions and tens of thousands of people coming to the border every day to nobody.
Nobody coming across the border. Right.
Not a trickle. So I think those are some of the things that don't get really commended. You look at all of, we see all the hyperbole and the bluster that comes from the president. But a lot of people don't realize that some of what he does is effective.
Right.
Has been effective. But the perception is that, we go to the National Guard conversation, right? It's some protecting the communities. Courts ruled that what the government did was illegal in LA. Courts ruled that. But people felt safer.
Mm-hmm.
Did people, the question is, did people feel safe in their neighborhoods with the National Guard there?
So yes, and here's a question on the court ruling that it was illegal.
Mm-hmm.
So the court rules that it's illegal based on an argument that was presented to the court, whether that argument is legitimate, false, or exaggerated or whatnot. I think that when it comes to actual immigration enforcement, it comes back, like, testing it to the Constitution. The guaranteed clause is what comes in here. Like, the United States government guarantees to every state a republic form of government and to protect them from invasion. So we have been invaded. This is not an immigration problem, to the point where, like, hey, we have some people in here that breaking our laws, what have you. We were invaded. And the greater problem in that invasion that, isn't getting enough attention is that our government facilitated that invasion. We have spent, billions of dollars, through NGOs to facilitate. And I've even been questioned about this. Like, you get into, conversation with people like, oh, how you don't have any proof of that? And you're right. I don't have a smoking gun, but I have the reports that are coming out that most people are realizing or reading for themselves and realizing to be, there's truth in that reality because it's obvious, right? It's logical. And when you consider, like, the logic aspect of it, you see all of these people coming from all over the world and walking across our borders. People that are supposed to be desperate and destitute. How are they crossing oceans to just walk across our borders in clean clothes? I mean, you're seeing caravans and, like, miles of people just flooding our borders. And that's because, we, through NGOs and, a wide network of NGOs and through USAID, we funded it all. So,
Absolutely.
With that said, that's the bigger problem. And this is where, like, I have, huge problems with our Department of Justice. And apparently, again, I know we're supposed to give them time, but if the people that facilitated that aren't held accountable, then, I mean, what are we? We're not, you know what I mean? Like, we're not a country. We're not sovereign. Like, people cannot, like, I mean, that's borderline treason.
Yeah.
One
of the agencies that really doesn't get looked at enough when you look at our immigration policy is the State Department. The State Department is actually who regulates and says who can come to the country, who can apply for asylum, who has a credible fear. Those are done by State Department decisions. And so, DOJ gets hit a lot, immigration gets hit a lot, ICE gets hit a lot, but the State Department never gets hit on immigration policy, and they're really one of the facilitators of immigration policy. They're the ones that also fund USAID. A lot of that funding comes
it's
through
cross-funded. It comes from the State Department to the USAID, and then it's allocated. And
absolutely.
I mean, that's a very good point. Like, the fire should be at their feet, and
I want Marco Rubio to just get a pass.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not naive by any perspective in the sense that, like, I realize that it takes time to get to the bottom of those things, but I'm also soured by the fact that I've been paying attention to civics for 30 years, and I've seen it over and over and over and over again. And my entrance into politics came from influence from my drill sergeants. I grew up in the struggle. You know what I mean? I didn't care about who was who, what party was what, but their influence, because they were coming in. Bill Clinton was coming in with all the defense cuts, so they were pro, like, Republican. So it wasn't like they said, "Hey, you're a Republican." It was just a natural thing for me to adopt. And when we invaded Iraq, after my eyes clearly told me that, like, what they were saying to us about 9/11 was no way factual. It was illogical. But and then we invaded Iraq, on Bibi Netanyahu's words of weapons of mass destruction. I realized that the Republican Party didn't stand for my interest because I quickly adapted a love for the Constitution through taking an oath to it. But having said that, that's years and years and years and years of being promised something by a party that I thought that I aligned with, and they give you nothing. So when I withdrew from that party, I did an about face. This was a friend gave me some advice. He was an independent. He hated both parties. And the beginning of our political conversations, because it was the beginning of my political intellect, if you will, was me trying to make a case for why the Republican Party was better than the Democratic Party. Like, I was one of them. And, he kind of, countered that at every turn. And then he was like, look, dude, you need to learn what I'm trying to teach you is you need to do an about face and study the political party that you think favors you and your interest. Just study them. Don't worry about the other party. He said, and this is the same thing you can do for a Democrat. Study the party that you think upholds your interest. Just watch what they do and watch what they don't do, and you'll find out the truth about that political party. And that was it, man.
And that goes across the spectrum.
Yeah,
that's not just Republican. That's Republican. That's Democrat. That's Green. That's you name it. And they all have. You can look at where we are in Baltimore, right? For example, and I know we're dealing with some national issues, but look at just a city like Baltimore. And I bring it up because that's also a topic of National Guard stuff too. But I bring up a city like Baltimore or cities like Baltimore, Detroit, or Chicago, Atlanta, Philly. You know, you look at a lot of those cities that are run by them that are under Democratic control, and they have there's a lot of similarities.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just say, there's a lot of similarities when you look at crime, when you look at spending, when you look at mismanaged funds, misappropriations, all of those things. You've had all of those in each of those cities, and not that it doesn't happen in red state cities or other cities. It's just that those are a lot of the most prominent cities in America that have been under Democratic control. And so the same thing, I did the same analysis as a Democrat and looked at the Democratic Party and said, well, what have you done for me as well? How have you helped our interests and my interests? And I look at the city that I live in, and I don't see where the interests of the people are being met. I see where the interests of a lot of politicians are being met. And, you know, they're fostering their careers and things like that. But if you're wealthy, you can survive in cities like that. But if you're not, you'll continue to, the cities will continue to fail.
I think our urban cities, the agenda from the top down is chaos all the way across the board. You know, the way that you see city after city that suffers from, exorbitant crime and, underperforming education standards, I could probably list a dozen things, but they're all consistent. Like you just said, it's consistent from city to city. You know what I mean? It's like a map, you know what I mean? And they're mapping it out city after city after city. So, there's no way that you could have that type of consistent failure or even consistent success if it's not driven by something that is, unique and the same for all.
Federal money. Right.
So it's federal money that comes into the cities, but the agenda, you know what I mean? I don't believe that the agenda is just for people to get rich. I think the agenda is actually to hold people down, to hold us down, to make black and white fight. Like we talked about this before. Like when you talk about racial issues in America, we're not talking about Asians and Hispanics having a problem with each other. We're talking about blacks and whites, period. We have a lot of history together, and that history there's a lot of bad in it. You know what I mean? And we have wildly different perspectives, from white citizens and black citizens to what the experience has been for either one throughout, let's just say, the last 400 years. You know what I mean? So the last 400 years is, from the time
that it makes, this is the conversation where people get uncomfortable.
Right.
And they don't like to have it. They get uncomfortable and they don't like to talk about the black and white issues. Right. But it's a real thing. It's a real thing. So, when people in the black community, they don't like to have conversations with white people about white people. And the same thing, in the white community, don't have conversations with black people about black. And I think that's where we need to cross that and crush that and say, you know what, the only way we're going to get to where we want to get to, a place where we need to be at, is to have some of those uncomfortable conversations. And then we have them comfortably. But the thing is people need to have those uncomfortable conversations, say, well, how does this make you feel?
Right.
And then when we understand how things make each other's feel, we can actually better serve our entire community.
So that's the best way to frame, like how I kind of opened up with, the red, white, and the black. So, it's white words fall deaf on black ears, and black words are falling deaf on white ears. And it's the poison that's been put into the well for so long. When
it's like taboo.
Yeah, when you see the media, like you just go back to like the BLM riots. Like forget about like what someone's opinion is of the riots. I was down in Baltimore. I watched it. I saw like it was. I mean, it was a ton of people. You know what I mean? And it was mostly peaceful. So I got that, but there was a violent part to it, and that violent part was triggered like right in the same area. That, like whether you can say, hey, they were paid, antagonists or whatever, it seems suspect. But all in all, the one thing the reason I said that is because through all those riots and I guess in Minneapolis and what have you, and the media that claims to support like the black community, claim to stand for the interest of the black community, they're painting that picture. While they're sitting there telling you, oh, it's a mostly peaceful protest, they're showing you the pictures or the live video image of windows getting crashed in and all the chaos. So on the other side, all the viewers are like, oh, black people are nothing but thugs. They're tearing their city apart. Their culture's destroyed. They need fathers. I mean, they continue to just feed all of those narratives. Yeah, right. So it's all by design, and it's the same thing on the flip side of it. You know, what's constantly being fed to the black community is that, you know, white people are privileged, and you know what I mean. We're superior. We get the best jobs, like, you know what I mean. And there's a lot of truth to how each side feels, but feelings aren't facts. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, you know, we have developed perceptions about things, and what this show, what Will and I are going to do is we're going to be honest. We're going to give you, like, he doesn't speak for the whole black community. Right. I don't speak for the white community by any stretch, but, you know, I'm going to frame things. The majority of the people that are in my circle, you know, I hear a lot of white people talk and rub shoulders with them a lot of times. I hear a lot of shit comments from them. You know what I mean? I hear a lot of good ideas from them, and I'm sure the same thing goes for his side of the equation. And, you know, we want to be able to bring that red, white, and black perspective to you as our audience with all the issues. And that's a great way to frame that.
Bringing it back to border security, what about the pushback that people see it as a weaponization of justice, or that they're overstepping the state's boundaries?
So if I look at it from a personal perspective, I think that, you know, border security, I mean, if you do it under the guise of border security, because that's the perception. The perception is that you're saying this is border security, but you're really doing something else. You're really coming in to control these cities, to control, and the perception is in the black community is that you're only doing this in black cities, right. in majority black cities.
Right.
And so that's one thing. So are you doing this because it's an immigration issue? And if it's an immigration issue, what was the immigration issue that you needed to raise? It was an anti-crime issue, then that's something different. But to do it under the guise of an immigration issue, I think that's part of the perception that you see from different communities.
So I would say let's look at two different cities right now. Let's put those under the microscope. First, LA. So actually, I should say let's start with DC. DC is a federal territory. Yeah. So the president is within his executive powers to mobilize the National Guard to make the city, you know, DC safer. You know, it falls under his executive power. Every other city in the nation falls under the executive power of their governors. The president of the United States has absolutely no authority to send the National Guard into a city to battle crime. In fact, Posse Comitatus, did I say that right? Did I get that right? Posse Comitatus. Yeah, Posse Comitatus was enacted, I think, in the early 1900s, sometime in the first, you know, quarter of the 20th century, and it prohibits the federal government from deploying the military into the streets for the specific purpose of, you know, fighting crime or enforcing law. But having said that, if we take it and look back at LA, the way that the troops were sent into LA wasn't to fight crime. It was to provide support for federal agencies, you know, ICE and DHS, as they went in to, you know, enforce immigration laws. That, I mean, he has the constitutional authority to do that. So it becomes, you know, it's a fine line, you know, when the troops are on the street. And, you know, I think every city in this country needs it. And I think just by what he's just done is he's exposed something I've been talking about for years. Like, why are the governors sitting on their asses and letting
all of this crime is happening in these cities around the country?
So the governors, like, and people will say, you know, it's a hotbed or a hot button issue between, you know, the red and the blue, right? So they'll say that, you know, the red states have the highest crime, and then the Republican argument will come back and say, oh, it's the blue cities in the red states. But if it's a red state, they're calling it a red state because it either has a predominantly, you know, Republican legislature or a Republican governor or both.
Right.
But if it has a Republican governor and a blue city is suffering to all those ailments, high crime, drugs, you know, underperforming schools. Yeah. The governor has a executive responsibility to his state. He is the governor of that jurisdiction, just like he's the governor of all the counties that seem to be doing great. Like, he's the governor of that jurisdiction, and he has a responsibility to protect the interest, the safety of the people that live in the cities. And again, you know, I'll let you take on after this point, but I think that, when you look at it and you see that both Republican governors and Democrat governors turn their backs on our cities, they let the schools fail miserably. And there's one common denominator in these schools and in these cities that they're predominantly black. I don't need a smoking gun. I don't need any other information from anyone. I am thoroughly convinced that is on purpose. It's an agenda.
Let me just to put a note in here. Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. After the Civil
Wales.
War Reconstruction, Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act. It prohibits the U.S. Army from acting as domestic law enforcement within the U.S. unless explicitly authorized by the Constitution or Congress. This law was designed to protect civilian rule and limit the military's role in civilian affairs.
Mm-hmm.
For a modern reference, the act does not apply to the National Guard under state authority or to the Coast Guard in peacetime. The military can support the law enforcement in certain cases if authorized by Congress. So that's where therein lies the rub.
Let the record show that I'm not always right, but I'm almost right every time.
Well, that's why I was putting a pin in that. So, Will, what's your take on that?
So, I agree with Rob. I believe that that a lot of what happens in a lot of the cities, even some of the ones that I named, is intentional, right? It's intentional. It's by design. They all have the exact same problem. It's not like there's some differentiate. They differentiate a little bit. They all have the exact same problem. Poor schools, poor neighborhoods, high crime. And I don't know if they see that these are all the triggers for all of these same things. Your policies are what's generating these what's happening in these neighborhoods, in these communities, these cities. But the governors do have a responsibility. And so I asked this question. I said, why is it that we don't see more state troopers in cities like Baltimore, cities like Philadelphia? Why aren't the state troopers there? You might not have had a situation where you had the executive had to come in and maybe impose the National Guard or bring in the National Guard. Had you exhausted all the resources at the state level, and the thing is, when you're the president, and no matter who the president is, and when you see all of this happen for years, all of this crime, all of this, homicides and shootings and all over the place, when you see this and you bear witness to it and you do nothing about it,
right?
How do you feel and how do you sleep at night? And do you really get to, this has been allowed for years, for decades. Been allowed for decades. And I can tell you, in my city, we've had over 3,000 people killed in the last 10 years. Over 3,000 people. 3,000. More that's been killed in Afghanistan and Iraq in the same time period. We've had more people killed on the streets of Baltimore that have been killed in Afghanistan.
One city out of 30, 40 cities in this country that suffer.
That's just Baltimore.
That's just Baltimore.
That's just Baltimore. 3,000 people over the last decade have been killed in Baltimore, on the streets of Baltimore.
Right.
More than that's been killed in Afghanistan and Iraq combined.
And here's the thing, too. Like, when you talk about something like that, this is white-black perspective. A lot of white people look at that and be like, well, that's black people doing that to themselves. You know what I mean? But that doesn't change the fact that, like, that's still a life, and that's a life that's lost. To me, I look at the cause and effect of everything. Like, yes, our city's in shambles. That's the effect. There are things that are causing that. You know what I mean? And there are people that are like caught up in that. But right now in Baltimore City, there's thousands of, young boys, anywhere from 10 years old to 12 years old. And right now they're innocent. They are victims of this. They're in the homes, they're in the projects, they're in, communities that are struggling. Forget about, whatever their individual circumstances are, but in the next 4 to 5 years, they become the young adults, 6, 7 years, that they become the young adults that, begin to become the statistics as well. So, we're doing nothing to reach into these communities to change the circumstances and the trajectory of these young people's lives to the point to where they can have a better future. We're almost sentencing them to, like, the Hunger Games. I hear, just throw them into the wolves and, see how long you can live.
Absolutely. If you think back, and I use the same time period, the same 10-year period where we lost 3,000 people in the streets of Baltimore. But at the same time, think of what was happening politically. We had rec centers that were closing. Mm-hmm. And these kids, when these rec centers were closing, these kids were 4 and 5 years old. 10 years later, 10 years removed, they're 14, 15. And now these are the kids that are out committing the crimes in the street. But you took away all the resources when they were young. And now this is the impact that they're having now that they're teenagers. And now you want to say, well, now we got to do something. People are still saying we still haven't opened up rec centers. We have to do this. We have to do that. But you took that away, and you took away fathers from the household, for example. You know,
they created an environment that drove fathers out, right?
Yes, that drove fathers out of the household,
and that's affecting both races. Like that's not just a cancer in the Black community. That's a cancer in America.
Absolutely,
right? That's a cancer in our underclass of America. Like, you know, when people are struggling and they can get a welfare check from the government, they can't get that welfare check if the father's around. You know,
right?
Period. I mean, that's ever since the Green New Deal. You know what I mean? That's been the cancer.
And what happens is the father ends up on child support,
right?
Even if he's there with the child, even if he's taking care of the child,
it's a violation of the 13th Amendment.
The mother now is getting free money from the government. The father's now in the system, and now you have a situation where now he get back up on child support, or the mother goes to, you know, and it's a vicious cycle. And if you're getting free money from the government, what is your incentive to go to work? What is your incentive to work at that point? You know, because I've seen people in my community. I've seen people that have said, "I'd rather not go to. It'll cost them more to go to work, than it would for them to get a check, because they have to now when they go to work, they got to pay for childcare. You know, you have to pay for all that. So there's a whole.
It stifles ambition.
It stifles the ambition.
I think that waiting list should be a HR application for available jobs. You need a check, then here's the job that you need to fill.
There's a great solve for the welfare system in the country. First and foremost, I absolutely oppose the federal government being involved in it at all. It's not an enumerated power to government. So, but on a state level, if a state governor had the mind about themselves that, you know, the approach to welfare, to me, first and foremost, you have a lot of fraud that's in welfare. You know what I mean? So the money that's being allocated to it, like if you could get the fraud out of it, you could take those resources and apply it more to the people that actually need it. But, you know, hear me out on this, because I'll say at the beginning, just to put it out there. Welfare should be a loan. So let's start there. Now, considering that's a loan, just like we can go into a young person can go into a bank and get, you know, $100,000 insured for a college loan, you know what I mean? And then not have to pay it back over a period of time until they get working and what have you. So we could kind of, you know, practice the same type of, you know, financing opportunities, or loan opportunities, I should say. But when you come into welfare, we're not just giving you a loan and saying, here's your money every month. We're going to say, what's wrong about you to that where you're having a problem function in society? What's the ailment? What's the struggle point? You know, and the struggle point could be that you don't have the skills, and this could be man and woman. Right. You could come to this particular welfare plant as a family. You know what I mean? We could say, okay, well, you know, she's waiting table. She's not doing very well. He doesn't have any schools. We're going to put him in a school to teach him how to be an electrician. And we're going to put her in school and teach her how to do medical billing, or be an accountant, or, you know, be an engineer, whatever the case would be. So now we've brought you into education and training. Now we want to find your family a place to live, and we want to put you in a decent community, not in Latrobe Homes. We want to put you in a decent community, and we want to give you an income that's consistent with the income for the skill that we're training you at. So now after 4 years, you both should be well through whatever training programs that you have. You're already living in a good house. You're already collecting an income, and you go out and you assimilate into your work. And now you have a $300 to $400 a month loan to pay back over a period of time. And the other side of that, like the repertory capacity for that would be like, there are some things that we need to address with that. So you can say, hey, you know, Black families that come into this program, we're going to, you know, either give you no interest or reduce your loan to nothing. And some people might qualify, you know, under certain circumstances where you don't have to pay your loan back. Right. But when you,
a portion of it forgivable.
But when you talk to, when you say it's a loan, what young girl is going to go get welfare that's going to bury her in debt so this guy doesn't have to support his kids? You know what I mean? What people are going to go and work under the table, you know what I mean, and have 4 kids and be on welfare if they have to pay the money back? You know, so I'm not saying that it would eliminate, you know, the waste, fraud, and abuse in welfare, but it would definitely put it in a better direction.
Well, I think it kind of levels the playing field a little bit,
right?
And on both sides, because if you there are a lot of people that go to school and get student loans,
sure,
you know, and you have to pay that back, but it was to make you better.
We could do a whole show on that too,
right? You know, It was to make you better.
Right.
And if you did those things to make you better, and it's a loan, and if you made a portion of it forgivable, then yeah, that makes sense. I think if that approach was taken, you'd have more people that would say, well, if I got to get a loan anyway, I might as well go to school. I might as well go get a student loan. It'll change the options.
Sure. Right.
It'll change the options. People just, they'll say, well, do I want $70,000 to pay back in this, or want $70,000 to pay back in this? And this may be more. But which one does the most good and which one causes the most harm? If it's easier for me to just 4 years and go to school and I'm out and I'm done,
right?
But you can accomplish both. But I think that's a different approach. I think it's a unique approach,
right,
to probably how the welfare system should be looked at.
I mean, there's a lot of details that would have to get ironed out in it. You know what I mean? But just as an overview,
put some benchmarks in.
Right.
You can put some benchmarks in and say, hey, if you complete in this period, a certain percentage of the loan is forgivable.
Sure. Right.
If you complete it in this period, so that would accelerate the program and say, now instead of 5 years, now you're done in 3, and that $70,000 loan now becomes $35,000.
Sure. Right.
And so that's the incentive.
Right.
That should be the incentive.
Yeah.
Not just sitting at home and doing nothing and just living. And for the life of me, a lot of people don't even know there are 15,000 people in Section 8 just in Baltimore, right? In a city like Baltimore.
That is a heavily abused program too.
People.
That's a heavily abused program.
But there are some good parts about it,
right?
That are not taking advantage of it. Section 8 has a whole home ownership program that is very underutilized. That is hardly ever utilized.
Did you know about that, Sean?
After we talked about it the other day.
Yeah, because I didn't know. That was
Section 8 home ownership program.
Right.
So you can be on Section 8, and I think there should be time limits for how long you can be on public assistance. I think if you're there longer than 3 or 4 years, I think that there should be some way you should be incentivizing the rest of your life.
But just think about in that respect though. If you just come in with a hardline approach to it and say, hey, here's the new rules, and then all these people have to somehow manage in an inflationary environment that they've been holding on to a crutch of the welfare system and just surviving in that, and then all of a sudden the welfare is gone. They don't have any skills, or maybe they do have skills and they haven't applied themselves. I don't know, but I think that this problem needs to be approached with both compassion and vigilance. The same as our immigration policy. But we went off on a tangent. I do have a question to ask you about the rec centers. Mm-hmm. Does rec center funding, does that come from the school budgets? No. It comes from the general fund, and it's funded through. So it goes through the general fund, and it goes directly to Department of Recreation and Parks. Okay. All right. So I wasn't sure if with a lot of some of them, I should say, being part of the schools.
It depends on where they are.
Right.
And that may be just Baltimore. It may be different in Baltimore County. It could be different in.
When you look at the funding, there's a book that's out by Chris Papps, and it's called Failure Factory.
Yes.
And it's actually, it's investigative journalism, but the book is based on urban community failures, by government failures in urban communities, the better way to say that. But he highlights something that's very critical that I saw just in the synopsis of his book. He talks about in 2024, the budget for Baltimore City schools was $1.7 billion, right? And he said 10% of the students tested proficient in math, you know what I mean, in Baltimore City schools. So, with that, naturally, you just want to do a little further research. So there's 155 schools in Baltimore City with a projected growth rate of 4 additional schools by the completion of 2026. So that meant that there was 155 schools in 2024 for that $1.7 billion budget. If you average that out, that's $11 million per school. And then I did the math. And I'm like, well, if every person working in school, if there's 50 employees in school and every person is averaging about $75,000 a year, that roughly averages out to about $3 million a year per school, $3.5 million per school. Where the hell is the rest of that money going?
That's the
you're talking about $8 million per school that would be unaccounted for. Now, again, I mean, there's obviously a lot of other additional costs to school for, things of that nature, but $1.7 billion is a lot of money.
It's a lot of, and a lot of that money is at North Avenue.
Right.
It's a lot of executive salaries that are paid down in North Avenue. And it's been, I mean, we were known about that for forever. It's just nobody's done anything
Right.
about it, and it's because, when you look at it, all goes back to the politics, right? Who appoints the school CEO? Who appoints the board of commissioners?
Right.
Where's the oversight? Who does the oversight? And I think those are some of the things that when we get to those situations, Baltimore, the price per student for Baltimore is one of the highest in the country.
Yes. That's the point he's making in that book.
It's one of the highest in the country, but we get the least. We get the least return on investment than anywhere else in the country.
Right.
Where we have some of the worst schools, and I know a lot of teachers in the city, and there are a lot of teachers that really want to do good work. It's just that they're not getting any help because the same communities that are creating the crime,
right,
are the same kids that are in the school. These are the same families that are, that the mother that we were just talking about, the ones that want public assistance, the Section 8. These are their children that are in the school. And so it becomes a whole snowball effect of everything. It affects the entire economy.
Absolutely.
But Mondawmin Mall is still the highest grossing cash mall on the East Coast.
No shit.
Right? Because, and I bring that point because it's the highest grossing cash mall because it's an urban mall and it's where a lot of the money that we see that we're talking about, it's where a lot of it gets spent. In situations like it.
I just through researching while you were talking, the budget is going up for Baltimore City Schools to $1.9 billion from 25 to 26. So last year's budget
hired a few more administrators.
Was $1.78 billion, right? And then when you have school superintendents that make almost as much as the president of the United States, and then they have an army of bureaucrats that work underneath of them, consuming all of that money. I mean, it's my contention that you can wipe out the individual departments of education and just have one state board of education, and you can have principals from all the schools vote to be the principal representation from the different counties and cities.
That sounds really simple.
Yeah, it's real simple.
My grandmother told me, she said, what's easy to do is easy not to do. Right? If it's easy to do, it's also easy to not do it.
Right.
And so some of the things that we think that make sense and that can happen overnight,
right?
It take them a decade to do.
Because it's willful, ignorance to it. They don't want to solve the problems.
No.
And you and I talked about this too. Like, so we were talking about like down in the city schools, which Mondawmin High School, right? Is that the one that's on Central Avenue?
No, that's on Dunbar.
Dunbar High School is on Central Avenue, right? So, Dunbar having the same, issues as, most city schools or inner city schools in Baltimore, where the kids aren't the lion's share, like upwards of 60 to 90% aren't proficient at reading, math, and science, right? The dropout rate is above 60%. Or between 50 and 60%. I'm not always right, but I'm almost right all the time, right? So, but having said that, if you just get into your vehicle, at that school and you drive about 5 miles into Baltimore County and you wind up, taking Lock Raven Boulevard, you wind up at Delaney Valley High School. They have a 90-some% graduation rate, which I think the statistics were upwards of 90% go on to higher education as well. All the students are proficient at reading, math, and science. And the black students in Delaney Valley High School and schools like Delaney Valley High School, they excel far more, than black students in the inner city schools.
Exactly.
So when you look at that, holistically and you say, okay, well, these schools are just 5, 6, 7, 8 miles apart, right? This school is suffering, badly. Like they're not doing their job. And the city is governed by Democrats, right? So when you point the finger and say the Democrats are running those cities into the ground, they don't know how to do schools or whatnot, but then you drive into the county and that's also governed by Democrats. You know what I mean? So what gives? Surely we know how to make a school do its job and produce, quality education and educate our kids and prepare them for their future. We're doing it just 6, 7, 8 miles away. And that's why I come back to there's no freaking way that anyone could convince me that it's not intentional.
Well, you know what I mean? Best practices right down the street. You have best practices. If you have, like you said, one school here, and they're 5 miles apart. And you can go even closer than that. You can look at schools like Gilman, Calvert Hall. You know, you look at all of these
Mm-hmm.
institutions and say, then why is it that right down the street you have this dysfunction?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I call it, it's dysfunction.
Complete dysfunction.
So why do you have this dysfunction down the street? We don't have to do a national search to look at best practices for how schools should be run. We can go right down the street 5 miles and see this is how you run a school. And why can't we take that model and say that Delaney Valley, that Calvert Hall, that Gilman, that Roland Park, why can't we take that model and put it in Baltimore City and say, this is how the school should be run? What are they doing differently?
Change one word there and say why don't instead of why can't. Why don't you take this model? Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't they? And what are they doing at those schools that we're not doing at inner city schools?
Mm-hmm.
What are they doing differently?
Again,
that's the thing.
I think the thing, and this is probably something that catch me a lot of hate for, but I think that it's with intent. I think that the Black community is intended to be oppressed, and some of them get away. You know what I mean? Some of them make it out of the struggle through the years. I mean, through constitutional and I guess just ordinary law. People make it out. There's opportunities. And like you hear people like Charlie Kirk is always saying that a Black person can do anything they want in this country. You know what I mean? They can be anything they want to be. We're in the greatest country in the world, and that's true. You know what I mean? But if and you and I might have talked about this. I think we did. If you just replace young Freddie Gray with young Dr. Ben Carson, you put Dr. Ben Carson, one of the brightest minds of our lifetime. Brain surgeon. He's the ethics, morals of. This guy should be sitting at the right hand of the Lord. You know what I mean? That's how much of a good person he is. And if you switched him and had Freddie Gray's mom raise him, like, is he Ben Carson? And then if Freddie Gray was raised by Ben Carson's mom, like,
is he Dr. Gray?
Is he Dr. Gray? Yeah. You know what I mean? So the thing that escapes people is that, yes, people can make it out of their circumstances, but it's the parenting. It's someone telling you that they love you and they believe in you and tucking you in at night and telling you to read a book and making you, holding you to your education and making sure that your grades are good. But what that does is that spurs dreams and ambitions in people. So when you look at the inner cities and you look at, especially in the projects, like there's nothing spurring ambition in there. You know what I mean? Nothing that would align with, the Charlie Kirks of the world and what, they proclaim as to how, anyone can be anything they want. I mean, you can on paper, but there's a lot of barriers that come into play. And, just someone who grew up in O'Donnell Heights, I've seen those barriers from the inside out. And the only thing that probably kept me out of jail and suffering a hard life was one day I just woke up and joined the Army. I realized, whole shit, I can't, like, have you ever seen the movie Get Rich or Die Trying with 50 Cent? Like, I watched that happen in O'Donnell Heights. I watched crack come in and take over our neighborhood. And it went from everybody fighting and, all kind of, anarchy to people getting shot like quick. And you realize that was going on in, all the Park Heights, like, Park Heights. You know what I mean? If you was a Donald Heights, like, you didn't go to Park Heights, like,
you know what I mean? That was the thing. That was the thing, Baltimore. If you lived over west, you didn't go east.
Right.
I grew up, and I say this because you made a very good point. I grew up in the projects. I grew up down in Murphy Homes, and we got a couple of dollars and moved to Lexington Terrace.
Right.
And then
that was moving on up.
That was moving on up at the time. It was going from Murphy Homes to Lexington Terrace to Park Heights. And when I was 16, my mother bought her first home. And coming from, an abusive childhood, all of those things. And I had every negative thing against me. Every single thing that you could have thought of that was there. My stepfather was abusive. He was also a big time drug dealer. All of that, so had all those negative things. The one thing that I had was I had structure in my home. My mother, I had a grandmother that was a teacher. She taught special ed. My grandfather was a boxer. Fought all over the world. Carl Coates. My grandfather was a boxer. Now he's in the Maryland Boxing Hall of Fame.
Nice.
And so those were the things that I had that looked at me that inspired me. My uncle was a Vietnam vet. Larry Coates, God rest his soul. But so there were things. My mother went in the military the year before I did. And me and my mother were the only mother and son duo to serve in combat in the history of the Army.
Oh, wow.
in the history of the Army.
Right.
The only mother.
Don't mess with his mama.
There you go.
Right? My mom does wear combat boots. You know? so when I tell people that, you know, it's your individual story, but also it doesn't mean that just because you live in a bad neighborhood, you come from a bad environment, that you can't see things that inspire you. That,
right.
and it was, for me, it was my family. It was internal. It was in my family.
But it's always circumstance, though. It's always.
And there was
right.
always that one. There was always that one person. Everyone that I know in the Black community, especially a lot of the Black men that I know that have come out of that have in a sense made it, right? Or made it out. You know, there was always one person that inspired them. There was either one man that inspired them or a woman that inspired them. You know, and they can always look back. It could have been a teacher. It could have been a barber. It could have been anybody. You know, go to the local. You go to the Black barbershop. That's like going to that is the Black country club. Right. It's the barbershop. The barbershop is the Black country club. So, you know, when you sit and you have those dialogues, you build those relationships. That's where a lot of that influence comes from. That's where ICOI is really within the community, and so when we see it not happening, it becomes a little discouraging, because you're like, well, dang, I made it, and we made it. Well, how come? What's the holdup with this next generation? And I think it's because they don't have the same. The people that were inspiration to us were our seniors, were our parents, and the parenting is different. So now when you look at 13, 14, 15-year-old kids, they're out there because the parenting is different.
So when you say that, though, like, what you're saying, though, is that this problem is solvable. You know what I mean? If you just put it under the microscope, you know, we can see it. What is it, the root cause of it?
That's right.
And I mean, it comes back to, you know, not to keep bringing up, you know, young Mr. Freddie Gray, God rest his soul, but, you know, he was, you know, a national subject, you know, and so what I witnessed with that, again, and I took the story and I created the story, so to speak, to kind of help me understand it and to communicate it and help other people understand where their failures were in judging him so harshly. You know, and if you just look at a young 11-year-old Freddie Gray, his mother battled, you know, was a drug addict. You know, I think it's been open that, you know, she battled crack. His father in and out of jail, abusive to him when he was around. So he really had no parental structure. You know, so when you have no parental structure, you know, you have to look deeper than and go, what does that mean? That means that you're not getting, you know, 3 meals a day. You're not getting tucked in at night. You're probably not having someone say your prayers with you or teaching you how to pray. You know, you're not checking your homework or caring about your education at all. And then young 11-year-old Freddie is going off to the city schools that are seemingly not performing, and they're not performing on purpose or, you know, just by complete failure, who knows? But his education is not being cared about there. And it's probably the one meal that he's getting a day. So when you look at that situation and you look at 11-year-old Freddie Gray and all the Freddie Grays that are in that situation, and you're like, man, there's not a red-blooded American that has a heart that wouldn't have overwhelming compassion for him. It's not little Freddie's fault. Poor little Freddie. That would be the dialogue. You know what I mean? What can we do to help little Freddie? Well, then you just add 6-7 years to his life. You know what I mean? He has a little bit of interaction with the law, and all of a sudden he's that fucking thug that you need to throw in jail and throw away the key. He's a piece of shit. You know what I mean? And that type of rhetoric was just blowing me away at the time when that was happening. You know what I mean? Because again, growing up in that struggle, knowing what it's like to be, you know, in his not the same circumstances, but you know, it's disheartening to say the least. But knowing that,
you know, you add to that, that when he's not getting it at home, he's going to get it. If he's not getting his influence at home, he's going to get his influence
on
somewhere
streets.
else.
Yep.
And so that's what happens most of the time.
Right.
Is that these kids will gravitate to what they think is hot, to what they think is popular, to what they think is cool, to how they're going to be perceived, all of those things. And so when you have these kids and they go outside and they see their friends doing this and their friends got this and their friends have things that they don't have, they want to know how can they get it. And when they figure out how they got it, whether they had to rob, steal, you know, in most cases, it's not that they went out and got a job and worked hard to get it. It's usually because they robbed, they stole, they sold drugs, they impacted somebody else's lives adversely to get it. And so that's where that's where this whole thing comes from. And this whole conundrum that we're talking about, where was it leads to a public safety issue where you have a conversation about bringing the National Guard. You have that conversation because of all of these underlying
Right,
things.
right.
We wouldn't need the National Guard if we fix these underlying
Right.
things. And that's what happens.
These things are absolutely fixable. If, and I know there's probably an analogy that people say all the time, like if I were president, I was governor. If I was governor, I'd fix that shit. I'd have that shit fixed in my first year. It's easy. And I've always believed, that the governor has the executive power, to declare a state of emergency over any territory and then use all the resources at their disposal to correct those problems. But the systemic failures that we have, we have gone, it's decades of oppression. It's decades of 14-year-old girls getting pregnant, having, 2-3 kids by the time they're 18, being on welfare. It's decades of 14-year-old young males getting involved in drug dealing and, pulling the trigger and spending the rest of their life in jail before they even had an opportunity to find out who the fuck they were in life. You know what I mean? And it can all be stopped. It can all be stopped with common sense, leadership. And the thing that always gets me is it's like it's an issue that's completely irrelevant. But if you talk about healthcare and say everyone should have healthcare, the thing that you're going to get from the right instantly, like with venom, is who's going to pay for that? You know what I mean? But yet we have a government that's exhausting $7 trillion. We have a city school in Baltimore that's getting $1.9 billion this year. You know what I mean? So that's roughly like 12, 13, $14 million a year, per school, and look at how bad they're performing. So we have the resources to do everything right 10 times over, but we're wasting money. We sit back and we allow them to launder our money away for their political interests. We allow them, white America, if you're listening, we allow them to put our black neighbors into these cities, to segregate them from us and oppress them. We've allowed that for decades. And then we want to look at the result of that problem and we want to cuss at it. Like we should be standing together, you and me, we should be standing together, all of us, and we should say we have the resources, we should fix that. And it is fixable. So, that's
just, and this is what I mean by having the reality of the dialogue. Mm-hmm. Right, the reality of the dialogue, what people get, and they can get used to this kind of content, right? Because when we can speak to white America and black America and cross those conversations and say, this is exactly what y'all need to hear, and sometimes it's not what you want to hear, but it's what they need to know,
right?
And in this conversation and in this dialogue, I think people can learn right now. All they got to do is go back and watch this show.
Red, White, and Black.
Over and over and over. Keep watching it, and you'll see some of the problems can be fixed.
Right on. Well, with that said, all things here, everything that we do is going to be the red, white, and the black, and we're going to test it to the Constitution. We're going to have many conversations, coming forward. We're going to be bringing you a show every week. We're going to be bringing guests to this show, and we look forward to getting down and dirty with you. So we're the Revolution Blueprint. I'm Rob. This is Will. We'll catch you next week.